There's a lot to say about Romaine. We won't come anywhere close to saying it all, but I suspect that what will happen today is that not only will we learn a lot more about Romaine and her friends and the life she led and the situations that she experienced during her lifetime, we'll come up with even more questions that will prompt research into the future. There is so much more to do on Romaine, so much that we really would like to know. Now, Cassandra Langer is our first speaker. Dr. Langer earned undergraduate and graduate degrees at the University of Miami and her doctorate at New York University. She's taught art history and criticism at Florida International University, University of South Carolina, and served as a visiting scholar at, it's a long list, but I'll keep it short, Hunter College, Queens College, the School of Visual Art, and the Feminist Art Institute. Sandy is an exceptionally accomplished writer. She has lectured and authored essays for museums around the country, and her articles have been published in Art in America, College Art Journal, Arts Magazine and Art Criticism, the Women's Art Journal, and my favorite, Ms. Magazine, the Women's Review of Books, the Journal of Lesbian Studies, and the Gay and Lesbian Review International. Sandy describes herself as an accidental biographer of Romaine Brooks when she was looking to uncover the artist's aesthetic and really probe, the whys and wherefores of the way Romaine Brooks's paintings look. This activity led her to rethink the narrative of Brooks's life. So she's done an inordinate, amazing amount of research in the US and Europe, and she's uncovered a wealth of new materials. She brings new understandings in a brilliant new biography that just came out this past fall. So, with no further ado, Dr. Langer.
Thank you so much, Virginia, for that lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure to me to be returning to the Smithsonian as I was a postdoctoral fellow here, and it once more points up the importance of funding for research, because without this opportunity afforded me by my Smithsonian research grant, I would most probably not be standing before you today relating my adventures in rediscovering Romaine Brooks and her circle. Before I begin, I'd like to also dedicate my presentation to the victims of the Orlando tragedy. I'm from Miami. I had to go down the entire list looking for friends I knew who moved to Miami, but that's not the point. It's my community. It doesn't matter whether you knew somebody or didn't know somebody. The enormity of the event impacts all of us who care about American values. In essence, my thoughts and condolences are with the wounded, grieving, and their families, as I familiarize you with yet another gay person's contributions to our society and culture. Over the last 4 decades, since I first published the article that was the first on the lesbian expatriate and painter, Bernice Goddard Brooks, the state of queer culture and theory has brought about remarkable changes in how the world views the contributions of GLBTQ citizens. One of the most accomplished women of the interwar period, Brooks' work reached its apogee between 2 world wars, during which time women were facing daunting challenges. As a woman, artist, and lesbian, her life is set against a world backdrop of monumental change, in which she played a significant part through her development of the lesbian body in art. She stands alongside Virginia Woolf and Gertrude Stein as a major participant in the intellectual and artistic life of her times and beyond. She was an alchemist at mixing subtle color on a tonal scale that aspired to a tone poem, or a Debussy-like orchestration across the painted surface. This is very obvious in even her earliest work that was influenced by various English, French, and American painters, as you will see throughout the current exhibition. Romaine was a very private person, however, who kept her secrets in art and life close. So it comes as no surprise that she rarely acknowledged painters who influenced her. Her aesthetics remained largely unexplored until I read between the lines to explain her beliefs and how she applied them to her paintings. In my book, I discuss DAnnunzio's ideas of what is noble, true, and good, contemporary French theorists, and Bernard Berenson, who she walked the hills of Florence with, talking art and aesthetics. Moreover, she was profoundly influenced by her relationship to music. My book, for the first time, presents what I believe to be her visible and visual interpretations of sound and silence, how she translates these into pictorial equivalences in her paintings. Just one glance is not enough to fully appreciate and experience a painting by Brooks. It has taken me years of study to translate the emotional strength in her pictures to viewers. Romaine Brooks makes demands of the viewer because she believed only the most refined sensibilities could fully appreciate her artistry. Her images command you to see her art, not just look at it, glance it, and dismiss it. Brooks has been marginalized because of her deviant sexuality, and most significantly due to the homophobic misunderstandings of her lesbian domesticity. Romaine Brooks must now be seen in a holistic context, including a vibrant and passionate family life. An interviewer recently asked me if she was a feminist. I happily answered him she was one of the first modern artists to depict women's resistance to patriarchal representations of the female in art. As such, her portrayals of new women became a site of political struggle that is still ongoing as we celebrate Hillary Clinton's historical breakthrough in becoming the first female presidential nominee of a major political party in our 240-year history as a nation. Amazing. Thus, Romaine Brooks' art must be revalued in the context of her times and of our own. One of my chief objectives in writing Romaine Brooks, A Life, was to correct many misconceptions and chronological errors made by earlier writers who did not have the advantage of having found new information that I uncovered. A sad truth is that few female artists of the 20th century have gained the world renown of their male counterparts because of sexual discrimination. But recently, several women artists have become household names, including Mary Cassatt, Georgia O'Keeffe, Frida Kahlo, and Agnes Martin. And there are many other Americans and lesbians among them, as Helen Langa will fill you in on. So the question then becomes, who was Romaine Brooks really? There are several reasons we don't know more about the life and work of Romaine Brooks. Primary among them is the hidden nature of Brooks's own ambivalence about her privacy versus being famous. Who was Romaine Brooks, essentially? There are several reasons we don't know more about the life and work of Romaine Brooks. Primary among them is the hidden nature of Brooks's own ambivalence about her privacy versus being famous. Because of growing up in a horrendous environment, she became a very mistrustful person at an early age, who, as her friend Breyer asserted, suffered from a form of PTSD. As I searched for the real Romaine Brooks, it became clear that she worked at perfecting this created thing over time, not unlike the legendary David Bowie. All her life, she feared exposure of her vulnerability and therefore needed to create a mask to hide behind, which you saw in the beginning of this presentation, her 1923 self-portrait being the epitome of that masking. And she did just this, using her powers of self-creation to construct Romaine Brooks, the artist. Over the years, as you can see from her self-portraits, she became very good at having the artist cover the very damaged, vulnerable, and needy child she at heart was, who longed for the love of a mothering, not smothering, mother-lover. The question is, who really was Romaine Brooks, and how did she become the artist we currently study and appreciate? Although born with a silver spoon in her mouth in a hotel room in Rome, Brooks had a Gothic childhood replete with a mad cousin in the attic, and abusive and cruel mother, conservative and cold sister, and an insane brother, Henry Saint-Mars. As a child, she was beaten and humiliated, as this drawing testifies to, where you see her huddled in the background, and she grew up in this chateau that you see on the right, the Chateau Grimaldi. Yeah, it's not coming. There we go. Sorry about that. Just let me know if the tech is failing us. As you can see, mammoth, and she reserved the top floor. Her mother reserved the top floor for her, where she found it intolerable because of the furniture and the wallpaper, and ended up, for probably the first time, asserting her gray scale, in that she covered the wall with gray paper in order not to get headaches and migraines from the decor. As I searched for the real Romaine Brooks, it became clear, as I said, that she worked at perfecting this entity that we see and that we identify with her. Her Gothic childhood was replete with all of these elements. As a child, she was beaten, humiliated, abandoned, and rejected by her mother, who was in love with her brother, and traipsed all over Europe seeking a cure for his madness. Saint-Mars was both Romaine's protector and most likely sexually abused her. So she identified with Joan of Arc, who became her model for a stoic personality, and was determined not to be spiritually broken by her mother's cruelty or her brother's insanity. From her student days until the death of her brother and mother, within a year of each other in 1901, Romaine lived on a small allowance that she managed to induce her mother to give her. This enabled her to study art in Italy and France. As you can see, she was quite talented as a young student. And she spent time on the Isle of Capri, where many gays, lesbians, and bisexuals had gone to escape the homophobia fallout from the Oscar Wilde trial of 1897 that sentenced him to 2 years in Reading jail, after which he became an outcast and died of cerebral meningitis in 1900. Let us recall that when Brooks arrived in Paris as an 18-year-old girl, she came of age in a city that was the cultural capital of Europe. She immediately involved herself in the life of the city. Among the pleasures she embraced was the new sport of cycling for women. She was athletic, an active walker, and an early adopter of sporting fashions. She regularly went biking wearing bloomers, which shocked her mother, who thought her behavior scandalous. She was rebellious and disdained the standards set for wealthy young ladies of her class. Romaine often disembarked at the Chinese pavilion, which you see there on the left, where fashionable ladies took refreshments. It was here she came out sexually when an attractive, fashionably dressed older woman hit on her, seated herself at Romaine's table, and they went home to the women's apartment that afternoon. She was nothing if not adventurous. The force of accidentally seeing Romaine's self-portrait of 1923 at the Whitney Museum of Art, which Virginia mentioned, in New York City as a graduate art history student made me determined to find out more about her. I began my inquiry by spending 2 weeks reading the Romaine Brooks papers at the Archives of American Art. I had just completed my research when I was abruptly commanded to see Mrs. B., Adeline Brieskin, the chief curator who had visited Brooks in Nice shortly before she died, as Virginia mentioned. Mrs. B. was concerned because I, a mere graduate student, had mistakenly been allowed to read the Brooks papers, which were restricted. Mrs. B. was formidable and had a reputation as the foremost Mary Cassatt scholar in the country. She was patrician and impressed me as beautiful and smart. She told me all about her visit with Romaine and offered to review my article before publication. I was flattered, naturally. Little did I realize that she was probably doing damage control. After reading my draft, she cautioned me that emphasizing Romaine's lesbianism might not serve me well in my future career, which did prove to be true. Being brash, young, and gay, I paid no mind. My essay, the first academic article published on Romaine in America, appeared in 1981 in the new art journal, Art Criticism, edited by Lawrence Alloway and Donald Cuspit, two premier scholars at that time. Then, despite a full teaching schedule and other interests, I kept the idea of doing a critical study of Romaine's work in the back of my mind. This on the basis of the extraordinary quality of her work, which you can see here in her morning portraits. You see the sketch here and then the finished portrait in which she adds all of the nuances of emotion to the painting. And I think what I saw as her radical approach to modernism. From the start, I always considered her queerness paradoxically essential and beside the point. The simple truth is she was a great artist whose work has been misinterpreted and overlooked. I needed to understand why. Umberto Eco, a great apostle of beauty, declared, and I quote, "Charm and sexiness depend on a glance, a movement, a gesture," unquote. Romaine Brooks was able to capture all this and more in her portraits, including these. She understood that women in art had been portrayed as objects rather than subjects. She made it her mission to change that for once and all, and did. I hardly need belabor this point. Sexuality, gender, and identity are now at the cutting edges of the current art scene. But Romaine Brooks was ahead of her times and started this conversation long before it became fashionable to do so. Romaine Brooks never pandered to trends. She deliberately disentangled herself from the modernisms of her day to become her own authority on what was good and true in art and design. She applied the same standard of aesthetics to everything in her life, including her personal relationships. It wasn't until 1901, while living in Capri with the death of her brother and mother, that she and her sister, Maya, became independently wealthy. This changed everything for Romaine. She entered into a mariage blanc with John Ellingham Brooks, who had been lovers with Somerset Maugham. She cut off her long hair, purchased hiking clothing at our boys' shop, expecting to go off on a sketching tour. Her husband was horrified and pulled the "no wife of mine" card, as well as inquiring about her making a will to protect our money. This did it for Romaine. The marriage lasted less than a year, and she moved to London and took a studio there. Her life and art from that point forward. Romaine was a maverick. After she inherited her money and left her husband, she was in command of her own life. She moved to Paris in 1905, possibly in pursuit of a lover, Winnaretta singer, the Princess de Polignac, who I'm showing you in the next slide, if it works, yes. And in looking at this, you see her portrait of Winnaretta, which is lost and we only have in a photographic representation. We hope it still exists and we're still searching for it. And she acquired a beautiful apartment on the right bank and a studio. Here we see her apartment, which is very interesting. You see her at the piano, and you see the importance of music in her life, and you also see one of the paintings of a young girl, which you'll see in the exhibition, in this very bad reproduction. Once settled in, the 31-year-old Romaine Brooks worked hard at perfecting her creative entity, the artist. Like the legendary David Bowie, as I mentioned, she became very good at projecting her confected self. But this was just a cover for the very vulnerable and needy child she still remained. She was a trendsetter and reimagined interiors in a way that excited both the left and right banks of Paris in the first decades of the 20th century. Her emphasis was on the relationship between art and object, not just her own, but artists she liked, including Bonnard and the old masters she collected. Early on, she became friends with very many of the tastemakers of the era, and I'll show you those in a moment, Lily de Gramont, and the performance artist and dancer Ida Rubinstein, the Lady Gaga of her day, who I will show you in a minute, who performed regularly with the Diaghilev Ballet Russe to the delight of Paris audiences. Romaine also met and bedded the Sapphic poet Renée Vivien, who just had a birthday last week, who had been lovers with Natalie Barney. And here you see them both, Ida in a postcard from the period with her pet panther who terrified Diaghilev, so much so that he had to jump on a cocktail table to get away from it. And Renée Vivien here on the left. Vivien was a very interesting person who was an Anglo-American whose real name was Pauline Tarr. She was considered the best symbolist poet in Paris at this time. Vivien cross-dressed regularly, and she made cross-dressing fashionable, a fashion statement that I may say can still be seen influencing contemporary clothing. Try, if you can, to imagine Romaine and Natalie as young gay women in Paris at the turn of the century, the world before them. It doesn't get much better. As Audrey Hepburn famously said, Paris is always a good idea. And this was the Paris that they were functioning in. You see the sets from the Ballet Russe, which set the whole of Paris aglow with the opulence of these sets and influenced fashion for decades afterwards. She met Lily de Gramont, and you see Ida here in her costume, which electrified Paris and made her the absolutely adored star of her era. And you see Lily here in a later painting with her dog, and you get some sense of her stature at this time. Brooks lived a life that combined stylish dandyisms with bohemian independence that allowed her to indulge her fantasies, both public and private. Romaine met and painted woman of letters Anna de Noailles, who you see here. It took Romaine several passionate love affairs before she formed a stable, polyamorous triangle with the notorious Natalie Barney, who became the love of her life. Prior to this, she had various affairs with Winnaretta singer, the Princess de Polignac, who Sylvia will speak of following me, the Marchesa Cassati, and an unknown lady who she rebuffed by saying, and I quote, "I can't be loved like that," unquote. Romaine was very style conscious, and she painted celebrities and hung out with theatrical stars. Her circle included the many wealthy and well-connected people in society who were standing in line to be painted by her. Among them, and you'll see this in the exhibition, Madame Erasures. And also, you see her painting white azaleas, which I want to make a note about following this. After my book's publication, as is so often the case, I discovered that the composer Manuel de Falla, who moved to Paris in 1907, had given Romaine piano lessons and dedicated a composition called Chinoiserie to her, probably inspired by the painting you see here on the left, White Azaleas, which he usually saw in her Paris flat. And I want you to take note because it's often mentioned that Whistler influenced her, and I think it's probably true, although she never acknowledged any outside influences. You see the boats that are depicted here. When you look at some of Whistler's paintings and some of his graphic images, note the way he renders boats, and you will see those influences which she never acknowledged, basically. So we have here then facts that come in after publication constantly, and I have some for you later on in this presentation. She met Gabriele DAnnunzio around 1909, 1910. It's indeterminate, the exact year, although there are evidences that she actually got to know him at a luncheon in 1910, although she may have known him from Italy and friends she had there prior to this. At any rate, he was a notorious womanizer as well as a renowned writer and poet. They felt an immediate affinity for each other that has led several writers to speculate that they had an affair. But Brooks refutes the notion that they were ever lovers in her memoir, which is available from the Smithsonian online for those of you who do a lot of surfing. You see here two portraits that she did in 1912, 1914, one of DAnnunzio and one of herself in a Byronic pose, and the one that's on the cover of my book. After all, he had said to her, "You are not a woman." Hardly one thinks that having said that, he would have been in bed with her. And they referred to each other as brothers. Now, I have to note that I have an exciting announcement to make concerning this pair at the end of my talk here today. Romaine, of course, had style, and she quite often dressed in masculine attire and in man-tailored suits, many of them designed by herself, because she was very active in her own creativity, including designing jewelry for her lover, Natalie Barney, and for her lover's sister. And I think the Smithsonian may have a piece that she designed actually here in the collection. At any rate, she had many friends who were very instrumental in supporting her work. Among them, Robert Montesquieu, who was the model for Proust's Charlot, and Cocteau, who she painted around 1912. Now, this is only one side of the original painting she did because she decided that she didn't like the way the composition looked. There were two women in it, and she thought he was, as a gay man, better off solo. So this is how she painted him. Later, they had a falling out, and she absolutely despised him. I write about that in the book, too. She also made friends with other people that were a part of her circle, including Elsie de Wolfe, who later became Lady Mendel. She was an actress and decorator. Some of you may be familiar with her book on interior decorating. And Janet Flanner, who wrote for The New Yorker under the pseudonym Genet. Around 1910, as I said, she became involved with DAnnunzio. However, even dear friends quarrel. Such was the case with them. And you can see this triangle that emerged at that time. You have Romaine and Gabriele On the photographic side, you have Ida in a painting called The Weeping Venus, which was done by Romaine and commented on by DAnnunzio. And you also have the problem of jealousy emerging at this time. Romaine became disillusioned with DAnnunzio, who was staying at her villa, and fled back to Paris after their falling out. She then took revenge on him and became involved with Ida Rubinstein, who DAnnunzio wanted for himself. And you can see Ida here, the epitome of style and fashion and everything that you want in a lover at this point. She took revenge on him because she completed a satire, now lost, which you can see here on the left, in which Ida is presented as the blonde figure with DAnnunzio, the dwarf-like figure, shooting arrows. She invited him to the studio to see the painting when she completed it for a private viewing, and I think a final sort of restitution of their friendship on a different basis. And you see Ida in the nude here, which Romaine painted her many times, and among the only nudes that she did. The whereabouts, unfortunately, of this painting also are unknown and only known to us through photographs. Now, you would think that Ida was very superficial because of all this glamour and because of being a fashion icon. However, Ida was Brooks's most inspiring muse, and she fell madly in love with Romaine. Ida was Jewish, a white Russian, the Lady Gaga of her generation, as I said. She was ravishing, as you can see from Romaine's portrait of her, and the reigning diva of the moment. As such, Ida embodied the new, bold woman of the 20th century. To her credit, despite being a fashion icon and worshipped by high society, Ida stepped up to the plate during World War I, turning her residence into a hospital and nursing the sick. Oops. Yes, here we go. Here you see one of the famous and most inspiring paintings of World War I, which helped buoy up the spirit of the French people, and it's called The Cross of France. And you see Ida here, who everybody would have recognized as a celebrity, but also serving as a nurse and stepping up to the cause. If you look at the statistics I'm presenting here, you can realize the incredible impact of World War I on this generation. I think it is something that most people don't realize. Out of a total of 65 million killed in the war, basically maimed and so on, 57% were killed out of that 65 million that were wounded, maimed, and impacted on. It was considered by Romaine's generation the worst war, and by those who lived beyond it, probably worse than World War II, if you can imagine that. Ida and Romaine's affair ended during World War I. Ironically, after breaking up with Ida sometime around October 1916, rather than 1915, which has been the published date for their meeting, rather it is October of 1916, Romaine found true love with the consistent but non-monogamous American expatriate heiress Natalie Barney. Here you see Barney and Lily de Gramont at Niagara Falls. I'll explain that in a minute. The stability Romaine had been yearning for all her life materialized after a fierce rivalry between Romaine and her old friend Lily de Gramont, who had been Natalie's steady for 9 years. This resolved into an enduring triangle. When Romaine finally became part of Barney and de Gramont's household around 1918, and here's a drawing that may allude to that situation. She entered into an extended family with her two partners, who she painted, Natalie on the left and Lily de Gramont on the right, that included Natalie's sister, Laura Barney, who you see here in a drawing by her mother, Alice Barney, and Alice Pike Barney. Laura managed the household's finances. The arrangement became the base for Romaine's security and lasted until Lily's death in 1954 and beyond. She depicted her other family members, as you saw, in 2 stunning portraits. While Natalie and Lily had signed a marriage contract, Romaine celebrated her bond with Natalie and Lily by painting those 2 portraits. The artist was thus able to maintain and sustain an unconventional long-term relationship. It was one that did not require her to give up too much of herself and the time she needed to be creative. It was a delicate balance that enabled her to achieve a near-perfect artistic equilibrium and satisfying family life when they were together. Their arrangement was easy and delightful, loving and sexy, because they made space for their individual eccentricities and affairs. Romaine bought the Villa Cercola sometime around 1918 as a place where she worked, played, and spent time with her family of choice. This is one of her models in a typically playful pose with the veil. She had an on-again, off-again affair with the pianist Renato Borgatti, who you see here in a painting by her, which is also in the exhibition. And a short affair around the spring of 1925 with Venetian Baroness Mimi Franchetti, who you see here, a wealthy, suicidal heartbreaker. Mimi was a Rothschild from the grandest Jewish family in Venice. Romaine bedded her and then passed her on. Romaine's great self-portrait. It's probably her most iconic work and the one people are most familiar with, but interpretations really haven't gotten at the depth of what she did in this portrait as far as modernism is concerned, and radical modernism at that. Her self-portrait of 1923 must be seen as a performative depiction for public consumption. One of the greatest things about becoming Romaine Brooks was her understanding of the role clothing and style played in creating a character, essentially. What she did here was, she was famous for her ochre powder, and you see the face powdered in this manner. And you see that the depiction is very purposeful in this sense. She presents herself as this extremely confident, contained personality, but she's also emphasizing the part that she is a woman and she is a hero. And you see this because of the red lipstick in the white powdery face, which makes it perfectly clear she's a woman. She has, which you can't see in this reproduction, the Legion of Honor in her lapel, which she was given for her war efforts during the First World War, so she is also a hero in this sense. And there are also some other aspects to this portrait that get missed by very many people. And I think one of the things that gets missed is the fact of how she presents herself, not just the bright red lips and the thickly powdered face that mark the portrait subject as female and a fashion-conscious one, both hero and woman, modern, up-to-date. The gloved hand, which you can barely see in this, but which you can see in the exhibition when you go upstairs, with its turned-back cuff, has a long history in visual representation that is generally associated with seduction, usually that of a male returning a glove to a woman or a woman suggesting that she is open to seduction. Romaine's conception is radical in the sense that it serves as a marker, A, of aristocratic privilege and authority, but then also that she does not remove her gloves suggests that she is on the alert and in defiance of the conventions of feminine wiles, other words, not available to men. So her portraiture becomes a series of socially encoded messages about rank, gender, and availability. Romaine spent time visiting friends during this period. Now, the portrait that you see here, you notice that she's elegantly thin. Well, this was done in 1923. Here, her friend Man Ray took photos of her in the studio where she posed for him in 1925. As we can see, she was rather heavier and far softer in her demeanor than what she depicts in her self-portrait. Nonetheless, her impeccable taste, self-confidence, and strength communicates itself across the ages, winning her admirers far and wide. Romaine spent time visiting friends in England where she painted Lady Oona Trubridge, the lover of writer Radcliffe Hall, who became infamous for her novel The Well of Loneliness. As you can see, she certainly depicted Oona as she saw her. And contrary to former interpretations that the portrait is merely a satire, it should be noted that Oona, a fashionista, chose what she posed in, and her getup was popular with both gay and straight women of the era, including the wearing of a monocle. Here, spoofed in an English comedy that I'm showing you here, a TV series called You Rang, My Lord. Romaine had a wicked sense of humor, and she captured her friend Oona in all her superficiality. Troubled by Romaine's soul-bearing depiction, Oona wondered, am I really like that? Yes, really. She also entered into an agreement with the English painter Gluck, who I'm showing you here in a photograph and showing you Romaine's portrait. She entered into this agreement with the English-Jewish lesbian painter Hannah Gluckstein, known as Gluck, to exchange portraits of each other, but they had a falling out. Gluck never completed her end of the bargain, and we only know of her attempts by photographs. But Brooks performed masterfully in a canvas she entitled Peter, which is also in the exhibition, Peter, a young girl. During the mid-1930s, Romaine took a studio in New York City at Carnegie Hall. She socialized and painted portraits of the cultural critic Carl van Vechten, who she became close friends with, but later quarreled with and broke off the friendship, and with Muriel Draper, who she came to loathe. For those of you who may have read outdated depictions of Romaine Brooks as a sort of melancholy, depressive curmudgeon with severe psychological programs, I am happy to disabuse you of these false impressions. As a matter of fact, Romaine noted in one of her notebooks that a day without laughter was not worth living, and she had many laughs, as you can see from the portrait of her friend Oona. What my scholarly sleuthing reveals is that Romaine was spirited and talented and always went her own way, never conforming to anyone's taste but her own. Brooks had high standards of excellence in both art and life and could not stand anything she considered substandard. I have to say, first of all, she was first and foremost a pacifist, and you have to know that about her. She said no artist stands for war, and she believed all war, given her experiences in World War I, was bestial and inhuman. She fled to Italy, where you see the Villa St Agnes here, pictured that she bought at that time. She fled to Italy because at the time Mussolini's Italy was neutral, and she bought this villa and a farm there. Her war memoir, available online, details how she and Natalie Barney spent the war years on the hills of Florence. visiting with people like Bernard Berenson and his wife, Mary, who is pictured here, and socializing with them. The backstory of how they ended up stuck in Italy for the duration of the conflict, 6 years, is fascinating and was, until now, lost to history. They constantly evoked D'Annunzio's name, thinking they would be protected from the fascist authorities who were constantly questioning them while they lived there, in a similar fashion to Gertrude and Alice under Bernard Fay. It seems that Natalie was trying to convince her partner, Lily de Graumont, to escape with them to Switzerland. While she was visiting Romaine, fate intervened. Italy entered the war on Hitler's side and closed her borders. Natalie and Romaine were never able to get the 3 passes required to leave the country, where they hoped Lily would join them. Lily, a princess of the blood and a French patriot, had no intentions of leaving France during wartime. Thus, her partners were forced to sit out the war together, the only time they lived together, under harrowing conditions that included being threatened with deportation to a death camp for the duration of the war. Romaine was never a card-carrying anything, but she and Natalie, much like Gertrude and Alice, needed protection and evoked D'Annunzio's name every time the authorities questioned them, because he was still a widely revered Italian war hero. By the time of World War II, D'Annunzio was no fascist and loathed Mussolini as a betrayer of the Italian people. Her fears, of course, about the war and from the horrors she had endured during World War I really turned on her worries about the communists plundering civilization. She had heard all about it from Ida during World War I and what it was like when the October Revolution took over. She and Natalie were pacifist, an attitude shared with many conservative modernists of her generation. Add to this fact that the only source of news she and Natalie were getting daily was Axis propaganda that led them to believe that Hitler might be a real peacemaker, based on his published overtures to the Allies that he routinely violated. Moreover, she never advocated exterminating the Jews and had at least 3 lovers who were Jewish or had Jewish blood. She also had many friends like Bernard Berenson who were Jewish. Berenson was a rabid anti-fascist. And she had extended family members, including Laura Barney, who had married a Jew. Throughout her writings, she expresses admiration for the ancient race, especially where Ida is concerned. Ida was her most cherished muse and model for the time they were together. So I go into this and many other facets of Brooks's personality and psychology to try and unpack the baggage that has been unfairly laid at her door, while at the same time holding her responsible for her incredibly shallow grasp of the political realities of her time. Finally, I would like to comment on Brooks as a painter. You see here her Villa St Agnes. You see how it overlooks the road? It was taken over by the Germans because they could bomb any Allied forces that were coming down the road from her house. On the left hand, my left, your right, left-hand side, you see her portrait of Uberta Strozzi. It's a stunning portrait, which you will see in the exhibition. She did this in her mid-80s, in 1961. He was a good friend of hers. He came from an aristocratic, old Italian family dating back to the Renaissance, and you can still go to the Palazzo Strozzi in Florence today, which is now a museum and so on. It is a stunning testimony to Brooks's prowess as a painter. She had a cataract at that time. She had special arrangements made So the light would be right for this, and she complained incessantly that she was not up to snuff. But if you see the portrait, she was more than up to snuff. And in my book, I go into it as a masterpiece, which I believe it is, in capturing mood and personality of both the artist and the sitter. So now to turn to the shattering after the war. They were accused, or they were afraid of being accused of having been Nazi sympathizers because they had to survive, as many did. You see here that Romaine was rediscovered by the artist, surrealist artist, Edward McAvoy in 1967-68. He knew about her work in the 30s. Natalie made friends with him in the 50s. And by the 60s, he had gone to Nice and he had asked Romaine if he could show her drawings and so on and so forth. So you see here that it was his doing that brought her back to public attention. And at that time, they did an interview with her, which I rediscovered in the Smithsonian's archives, basically, where it had been misplaced for a very long time. So what you have then is this entire issue with 3 essays discussing her work, and the interview, which goes into detail that have been missed by a lot of people that have led to this exciting new discovery that I'm going to talk about in a moment. She was identified in the interview by the interviewer as the first surrealist. Now, nobody has given her credit for this, of course, because it wasn't really known, widely known. And when you look at the drawings in this exhibition, you will see why they thought of her as the first surrealist, because she didn't have any models to follow, and she really didn't follow Freudian psychology. She simply did it out of her own interior and her sense of that, basically. So I would like to finish, and here we have the picture of the 2 lovers at the end of their life. Romaine in 1970, you can see the sweetness of her expression, and Natalie Barney, who has the Carl van Vechten photograph of Romaine on her table there, along with a sculpture of herself and so on. Still vibrant, still interesting. In her studio at the end of her life, some of the paintings that Mrs. Breeskin saw and that the Smithsonian now has, and you see there white azaleas and several of the others. Recently, there was a major exhibition at the Fortuny Museum in Italy, just closing this year, and you see the installation here, very different from what you're going to see here. It's rather cluttered. By comparison, the walls are decorated, so there are distractions there, which there are none in this exhibition. Romaine would have approved, less is more. Now, rediscovering Romaine Brooks, which I've spent most of my life doing, almost 44 years at this point in time. They got it wrong, as my book says. And what did they get wrong? A, was she an anti-Semite? No. Was she a fascist sympathizer? No. Was she a misanthropic, deviant, homosexual? No. Was Brooks an introvert? Not exactly, as you've seen from my talk. She needed time to be creative. Was she an insanely jealous, possessive lover with intimacy problems, as has been suggested in previous biographies? No. And is her work any less deserving? Here we see Sargent's Madame X, and we see The White Bird, which is in Europe, by Romaine. It's bigger. It's in many ways more subtle and more interesting in its symbolism and in its relationship to art history. If you go out, when you see the posters, you'll see the Greek slave. And if you notice the position of the hand over the sex and so on, you see how Romaine had a vocabulary that went back to the classics. She was very influenced by classic Greek sculpture. And you have this pose. And they got it wrong again. She was a better painter in many ways than the males Another example, why isn't Romaine in the pantheon of American art yet? You see here Whistler's version of At the Piano, and you see Renata Borgatti, Romaine's version, which you'll see upstairs. And is her work any less deserving? Look at the size of this canvas. It's as large as anything any man ever did. And of course, this canvas is extraordinary of Ida, and it speaks to lesbian space, something nobody else was radical enough to do. So I think it's time to make it right. And by making it right, I want to talk about these two images. This image on the left, which is part of my exciting announcement at this point. I've had boots on the ground, so to speak, most of this summer. And my researcher, my research intern, Giovanni Rappazzini, has been doing research at the Victoriale in Lake Garda, the home of Gabriele DAnnunzio. Now, in the transcript that my translator and my compatriot in crime here, Suzanne Stroh, who is heading up the international research team for our Project Romaine here, discovered in the transcript a clue to finding one of Romaine's lost works. This work was a copy of a Perugino. I'm showing you the Perugino, but next week we hope to have an image of the copy that Romaine made of this painting and gave to DAnnunzio, which was thought lost for years. And nobody even knew it really existed, but we found it. And that only happened 2 days ago, folks, so I'm very glad to be able to have this announcement. Thank you. And I hope we'll be able to find Winneretta soon. The copy, why she made it. She made it because she thought it looked like her, but in the transcript that we had translated from the French, she says, well, I thought it looked like me, but then I decided it didn't, and so I gave it to him. So I'd like to conclude with that, and when the panel meets at the end of this, we'll be able to discuss any questions you have and any other things. Thank you very much.